Remember those clever cooking tricks 50s housewives lived by? And we somehow forgot? Back then, these everyday kitchen tricks meant full plates, less waste, and quiet pride. What did we lose when we stopped passing them down? Using mayonnaise as a moisture booster in cakes was one of those tricks that seemed odd on the surface, but in practice, it worked wonders. Housewives in the 1950s were always looking for ways to keep baked goods soft and rich without using up precious butter or eggs. Mayonnaise, made from oil and eggs, added fat and moisture without affecting the flavor too much. In fact, when added to chocolate cakes or spice cakes, it made them taste even better, deeper, smoother, and softer. You would mix a few spoonfuls right into the batter, and suddenly your scratch cake had the texture of something made at a high-end bakery. You did not need frosting to make it enjoyable. The moisture locked in so well you could eat it plain with coffee. This trick became a hit at school bake sales, church potlucks, and family dinners. It was also a quiet lifesaver when ingredients were limited or rationed. If you had mayonnaise in the fridge, you had cake potential. People back then knew how to stretch what they had and still make it feel like a treat. Today, it sounds like a shortcut, but back then, it was a stroke of genius. Clever, practical, and unforgettable. Saving bacon grease in a tin can was a ritual in every working kitchen. It sat on the back of the stove, lid popped open, ready to catch every drop of golden fat left behind after breakfast. Housewives did not waste what could be reused, especially not something as flavorful and versatile as bacon grease. It was their secret weapon for cooking eggs, frying potatoes, making gravy, or giving soups a richer taste. A spoonful could make bland vegetables taste indulgent. It was practically its own seasoning. The grease hardened as it cooled and would keep for weeks without going bad. You did not refrigerate it, you just trusted it. Bacon was not something eaten every day, but when you had it, you made it count. Even the drippings were valuable. Housewives taught their kids to pour it safely, and it was one of the first cooking lessons many daughters learned. You knew the home was cared for when you saw that tin. And if you brought it out for company, it meant you were serious about flavor. Today, we toss grease without thinking. But back then, bacon grease was pure kitchen gold. Nothing went to waste, not even the fat from your breakfast. Ice cube trays were more than just for ice. In the 1950s, housewives used them to portion and preserve homemade broth, leftover gravy, or any bit of soup that seemed too good to toss. Once frozen, those little cubes of flavor could be popped into a pot weeks later to bring life back into a stew, casserole, or skillet of vegetables. Chicken stock from a roast dinner? Poured it in. Leftover beef drippings mixed with water? Froze it too. This trick was both practical and brilliant. It kept meals from tasting bland and helped stretch flavor when seasonings were in short supply. Plus, it was a way to avoid spoilage without relying on bulky storage or wasting fridge space. Ice cube trays were cheap, easy to clean, and always handy. You knew you were doing things right when your freezer had a few trays filled with amber or golden broth. It made midweek cooking faster and tastier. Modern kitchens have gadgets for everything, but back then, a simple metal tray turned scraps into meal starters. Clever and quiet, this trick turned tiny cubes into powerful bursts of comfort and helped every meal feel just a bit more homemade. Storing celery in aluminum foil was one of those little-known tricks that separated a wasteful kitchen from a wise one. Plastic wrap was not yet a common household item, and Tupperware was still a novelty for many families. So when a bunch of celery started to go limp, housewives would wrap it tightly in aluminum foil and tuck it into the fridge. This simple act worked like a charm. The foil let just enough moisture escape while keeping the celery firm and fresh. No soggy stalks, no odd smells, no food thrown out. That foil wrap could stretch a single bunch for nearly 2 weeks. Kids still got their crunchy snack, and dinner still had that satisfying snap in a soup or casserole. It sounds small, but it meant less waste and more money saved over time. Housewives passed this trick down like family folklore. You saw your mother do it, so you did it too. It was quiet, unfussy, and brilliant. In a time when food was money and money was tight, even celery got the 5-star treatment. You may not see it on a box today, but aluminum foil was a kitchen MVP before it even had the title. Reusing cereal bag liners as wax paper was a kitchen trick hiding in plain sight. Once the kids had torn through their cornflakes or puffed rice, housewives would carefully remove the inner plastic liner, shake out the crumbs, and set it aside. This waxy, crinkly paper was not trash. It was an all-purpose kitchen tool. You could wrap sandwiches in it, cover leftovers, line cake pans, or even roll out pie dough without sticking. It was durable, clean, and, best of all, completely free. In the 1950s, every penny saved counted, and this clever reuse was like a quiet rebellion against waste. Homemakers found dozens of ways to repurpose what others might throw out. It was a lesson in resourcefulness, not just frugality. If you grew up during that time, you probably remember the sound of those liners being folded and tucked away in a drawer. That crinkle was the sound of a house being run right. Modern kitchens may have parchment and plastic wraps galore, but nothing beats the feeling of giving something a second life. In a way, cereal bags were just another example of how every part of the home was expected to pull its weight, even the packaging. Turning stale bread into homemade croutons was one of the simplest yet smartest tricks in a 1950s kitchen. Bread never lasted forever, especially before preservatives became the norm. But a housewife would never let a loaf go to waste. Instead, she would cut it into cubes, drizzle with a bit of oil or bacon grease, toss in whatever seasoning she had on hand, and bake until crisp. These croutons were then stored in jars and added to soups, casseroles, or salads for days to come. They brought crunch, comfort, and a sense of creativity to any meal. You did not need to buy anything new, just make the old new again. Kids loved them, husbands noticed them, and guests thought they were fancy. All from a slice that might have otherwise gone to the birds. It was a perfect example of homemaking in the 1950s, clever, quiet, and deeply practical. Housewives learned to turn a potential waste into a winning side dish, and the smell of toasting bread with a hint of garlic or butter, that alone could bring the whole family to the kitchen. Today, we buy croutons in boxes. Back then, we made them from scraps, with pride. Using evaporated milk as a cream substitute was an essential 1950s kitchen trick. Cream was expensive, spoiled fast, and was not always easy to find at the corner store. But evaporated milk came in a can, lasted forever, and delivered the richness housewives needed to whip up sauces, soups, and desserts. They would shake the can, open it, and pour it right into the pot like a secret ingredient. It thickened things beautifully and gave food that silky texture people usually only got at diners or supper clubs. It worked in coffee, mashed potatoes, fudge, even homemade ice cream. And it cost a fraction of what fresh cream did. Housewives swore by it, not because they had to, but because it worked. If you were lucky enough to have 2 cans, you could even whip it for pies or pudding toppings. It sounds like a hack today, but back then, it was just kitchen smarts. The pantry always had a few tucked away. In a time where smart substitutions meant the difference between skipping dessert or having something sweet, evaporated milk stepped in as the quiet hero. It made frugal feel fancy, and that mattered more than anyone let on. Making salad dressing in a washed-out ketchup bottle might sound like a stretch, but to a 1950s housewife, it was second nature. Once the bottle was empty, she would rinse it with hot water, add oil, vinegar, mustard, salt, sugar, and whatever herbs she had on hand. Then she would shake it up. No blender, no mess, just good old-fashioned elbow grease. That ketchup bottle became a reliable dressing shaker, ready whenever needed. It poured easily, stored well in the fridge, and cost nothing extra. You did not need to buy fancy bottles or mixers. You already had what you needed. It was clever, resourceful, and oddly satisfying. This trick came from the same spirit that saved string in a jar or foil in a drawer. Waste nothing. Use everything. Even if the bottle was glass, it still did its job. Housewives loved having control over their ingredients, especially with young kids at the table. No artificial flavors, just what they made themselves. Today we chase clean eating and low-waste trends. But back then, those ideas just meant doing things the smart way. And sometimes that meant turning trash into treasure with nothing more than a good shake. Soaking wilted lettuce in cold vinegar water was a trick passed down like a whispered kitchen secret. When lettuce started to droop or go soft, it did not get tossed. It got revived. Housewives would fill a bowl with cold water, add a splash of white vinegar, and let the greens soak for 10 to 20 minutes. It crisped them right back up. No waste, no disappointment. This simple trick saved countless salads from being sad or soggy. Before pre-washed greens in bags, lettuce came fresh from the store or garden, and it started wilting fast if not used quickly. But smart homemakers had ways around that. It also helped clean the leaves better than water alone, which was especially important back then. Lettuce was expensive enough without throwing it out before it hit the plate. The result? A crisp, refreshing base for salads that looked and tasted brand new. It may not seem like much today, but in the 1950s, this trick was gold. It kept family meals fresh, appetites satisfied, and budgets intact, all from a little bowl of water and vinegar. No one bragged about it. They just did it. And it worked. Stretching ground beef with rolled oats was not just frugal, it was necessary. Meat was pricey and often rationed, but families still needed protein on the plate. Instead of using a full pound of beef for meatloaf or burgers, housewives would mix in rolled oats. They soaked up flavor, added texture, and held the mixture together like a charm. You would never guess there was less meat. And if you seasoned it well, with onion, garlic, or even ketchup, it tasted like the full thing. Some even preferred it that way. It was healthier, heartier, and cheaper. This trick helped feed more mouths without sacrificing quality. You could get 6 burgers out of a half-pound of beef if you did it right. Housewives took pride in that. It was not about cutting corners. It was about making smart use of what you had. And in a time when every meal was cooked from scratch, that kind of ingenuity was respected. It made dinner stretch further, and everyone left the table full. Today we might call it a budget recipe. Back then, it was just how things were done, quietly clever and always thoughtful. Jell-O as a leftover preserver may sound like a party trick today, but in the 1950s, it was a serious solution to a serious problem: food waste. Housewives would take leftover vegetables, bits of meat, or even chopped eggs and suspend them in flavored or plain gelatin. The result was a molded salad that kept longer and looked surprisingly elegant on the table. It was not about being fancy. It was about stretching a meal into the next day and keeping it safe without refrigeration on every corner. Jell-O sealed the food in and slowed spoilage, giving families another day or two to use it. You would chill the mold in a shallow dish, pop it out when company came over, and suddenly leftovers became a centerpiece. Some folks raised an eyebrow at ham and lime gelatin, but others swore by it. And when choices were few, you used what worked. Housewives did not flinch. They got creative. It was frugal, clever, and oddly festive. That wobble meant something back then. It meant no waste, full bellies, and a little color on a dinner table that needed cheering up. Powdered milk to bulk up regular milk was not glamorous, but it sure was dependable. In big families with small budgets, milk disappeared fast. So housewives made it stretch by mixing whole milk with reconstituted powdered milk. You took a scoop of the powder, stirred it with water, and poured it into the fresh stuff to double the supply. It was not just thrift, it was survival. This trick made sure every child got a glass at breakfast, every recipe had enough for batter, and every cup of coffee got its splash of creaminess. Did it taste different? A little. But after a while, no one noticed. It became part of the routine. When you have mouths to feed and only so much to go around, a full jug matters more than the taste of a second pour. Powdered milk also stored longer and did not require refrigeration until mixed. That made it perfect for backup in a pinch. Housewives kept boxes in the pantry like it was gold dust. And truth be told, it kinda was. It gave a little more breathing room to a grocery bill that was already tight. Using coffee grounds to deodorize the fridge was one of those tricks that seemed odd until it worked. Back before baking soda became the default fix, housewives would scoop yesterday's grounds into a bowl and place it quietly on a refrigerator shelf. The grounds soaked up odor without adding any strange smell of their own. It was quiet, reliable, and made use of something already on hand. Housewives loved finding second lives for everyday items, and this one was a winner. If your fridge started to smell like onions or last Sunday's roast, the grounds pulled the stink right out. And they did it naturally. No chemicals, no fuss. Plus, it made opening the door a little more pleasant, especially with company around. You might not think about it today, but back then, no one wanted their butter tasting like cabbage. This little trick helped keep flavors clean, meals fresh, and dignity intact. It was one more example of turning waste into usefulness and making the kitchen work smarter, not harder. And when you are running a household on a shoestring, that kind of wisdom matters more than anything. Leftover mashed potatoes turned into pancakes was a breakfast staple for families who refused to waste a single spoonful. The process was simple. You took cold, firm mashed potatoes, added a bit of flour or egg, and dropped the mixture into a hot skillet. Crisp on the outside, soft on the inside. It was comforting, filling, and downright thrifty. Housewives in the 1950s knew better than to toss leftovers. Potatoes were cheap, yes, but not so cheap you could afford to throw them out. These pancakes stretched a single dish across meals and added warmth to the morning. You could dress them up with chopped onions, garlic, or even leftover bits of cheese. Fried in bacon grease or butter, they gave off the kind of smell that made a kitchen feel alive. Kids loved them, husbands praised them, and moms appreciated the ease. Leftover night did not always mean boring. It meant clever. It meant knowing how to make something new out of what had already served its purpose. These potato pancakes did not just fill bellies, they proved that a little imagination could go a long, long way. Crushing stale cake into dessert crumbs was the final act of rescue in a house where nothing went to waste. When a cake dried out or sat too long on the counter, housewives did not toss it in the trash. They broke it up by hand or used a rolling pin to crush it into fine crumbs. Those crumbs had plenty of uses. You could press them into a pie crust with butter and sugar, sprinkle them over puddings, or layer them into trifles. Some folks even used them as coating for fried treats or folded them into new batter. It was sweet, crumbly insurance that dessert was never far away. Cake might have gone stale, but the love behind it had not. Housewives saw these bits as building blocks, not trash. A stale dessert became the start of another. That was the magic of mid-century homemaking. You found ways to keep flavor alive. Even in the smallest scraps, there was purpose. A pantry full of ideas meant a family full of surprises. No one ever guessed that the pie crust had once been a birthday cake. And that was the point. Condensed soup as a sauce base was the shortcut that felt anything but lazy. Cream of mushroom, tomato, chicken, it all came in cans stacked high in the pantry. Housewives relied on them to turn plain casseroles into creamy, hearty meals with just one stir. Instead of making bechamel from scratch, you opened a can and added milk or broth. Suddenly, you had a thick, smooth sauce that tasted homemade. It was fast, affordable, and tasted good with nearly everything: pasta, rice, meat, or vegetables. One can could coat an entire dish. And when you were feeding 5 people on a 2-meal budget, that mattered. It helped bring consistency to meals and gave new life to leftovers. You could even mix 2 flavors to make your own twist. It was a blank canvas that worked with whatever was in the fridge. That kind of flexibility was gold in a 1950s kitchen. These soups may have started as shelf-stable convenience food, but they became a trusted tool in every cook's kit. Housewives did not just use them, they elevated them. And that was the trick all along. Wax paper pie crust rolling was a small, neat miracle in every baker's routine. The trick was simple. Place dough between 2 sheets of wax paper, then roll it flat without ever touching the counter. No flour clouds, no sticking, no cleaning up bits of dough from every corner. It made rolling faster and neater and helped keep the crust light. Housewives found that pie dough came out more even, less dry, and easy to lift into the pan without tearing. Wax paper acted like a gentle buffer, holding everything in place and making cleanup a breeze. In a kitchen where mess meant more work and time was precious, this trick was a quiet revolution. You did not need a fancy mat or special tools, just a roll of wax paper from the drawer and a steady hand. Even the rolling pin stayed clean, and once the pie was in the oven, you tossed the paper with no fuss. It was neat, clever, and all about working smarter. Tricks like this helped make dessert feel possible even on the busiest, tightest days, and that meant everything. Refrigerator pickling with vinegar and sugar was how housewives brought a little brightness into their meals without a full day of canning. You sliced cucumbers, onions, or even green beans, poured over a hot mix of vinegar, sugar, and spices, then sealed the jar and let it chill. No boiling water baths, no pressure cookers, just patience and a fridge shelf. In a day or two, you had sweet, tangy pickles that added snap and flavor to otherwise plain meals. They stayed crisp, looked colorful, and made sandwiches or roasts feel like something special. Best of all, it gave you control. You adjusted the sweetness, spiced it your way, and worked with whatever was in season. Refrigerator pickling felt homemade, but also modern. It was fast enough for weeknight dinners, but classic enough to impress guests. This trick helped housewives stay ahead, turning garden extras or produce drawer stragglers into little jars of joy. In a world where nothing was wasted, pickling meant preservation, not just taste. And every time you opened the fridge to that tangy scent, it felt like a little reward for doing things the smart way. Reheating cold biscuits with a damp towel was one of those little touches that made leftovers feel fresh again. When dinner rolls or breakfast biscuits turned dry overnight, you did not toss them. You brought them back to life. Housewives would dampen a clean kitchen towel, wrap the biscuits inside, and heat them in a warm oven for a few minutes. The steam worked its magic. Biscuits softened up, regained their warmth, and felt nearly fresh-baked. This trick made second-day meals feel like first-class dining. It took 5 minutes, no extra cost, and 0 complaints at the table. In homes where everything counted, even baked goods got a second chance. The towel trick was simple, quiet, and incredibly satisfying. It meant care. It meant a kitchen that did not quit. And most importantly, it meant feeding your family without apology. These little flowery rounds of comfort came back fluffy, warm, and ready to be slathered in butter. All because someone took the time to do it right. No shortcuts, just smart ones. Turning leftover oatmeal into muffins was a quiet revolution in the breakfast routine. Cold, sticky oatmeal from the morning pot often sat lonely on the stove. But 1950s housewives had no intention of throwing it out. Instead, they folded it into muffin batter with flour, sugar, eggs, and whatever fruit or spices were on hand. The result was moist, dense muffins that filled the kitchen with warmth. You could add raisins, apples, cinnamon, even nuts if you had some. No one at the table guessed it was yesterday's porridge. It became a treat, not a chore. And it stretched one meal into another with hardly any effort. The texture was satisfying, the flavor comforting, and the savings unspoken but deeply felt. Frugality met creativity here. Housewives did not just save food, they remade it. These muffins were humble but reliable. They showed up in lunchboxes, picnic baskets, and church bake sales. And each one carried the quiet message that nothing in this house gets wasted, not even cold oatmeal. Using cookie cutters for sandwich appeal was a trick every clever 1950s housewife kept in her back pocket. Lunches could be plain, but they did not have to look it. With just a press of a cutter, a square slice of bread turned into a star, a heart, or a teddy bear. Suddenly, that same old peanut butter and jelly became a little surprise tucked into a lunchbox. It was not just for kids either. Bridal showers, garden teas, and baby luncheons all saw trays of shaped finger sandwiches stacked just so. Even ham on white looked fancier when cut into circles and layered like petals. This trick was all about charm without extra cost. You used what you had and added care. It gave lunch a little lift, and for children in school or husbands at work, that small delight meant something. Housewives knew food was about more than hunger. It was about comfort, joy, and effort. A cookie cutter was not just a baking tool. It was a reminder that home cooking came from the heart, right down to the edges of the crust. Saving butter wrappers for greasing pans was one of the quietest and cleverest habits in a 1950s kitchen. After using a stick of butter, a housewife would fold the wrapper neatly and store it in the fridge or freezer. When it came time to bake, she would pull it out and use the residue to coat cake tins, cookie sheets, or muffin trays. It gave just enough grease to keep things from sticking, no mess, no waste, and no need for extra butter. You were not wasting a thing. That small swipe of leftover fat did more than you would expect. It smelled like something was about to be baked, even before the oven warmed up. Housewives passed this trick down without thinking, and their daughters folded the wrappers just the same. It was a small act of thrift, but it came from a bigger mindset. Waste nothing, use everything. Even paper soaked in butter had a second life. In homes where every bit counted, even the wrapper had a job to do, and it did it well. Folding leftovers into gelatin salads may raise eyebrows today, but in the 1950s, it was a practical and pretty way to make scraps feel special. Housewives would take bits of ham, chopped vegetables, or even shredded chicken and suspend them in flavored or plain gelatin. Poured into a mold and chilled, it transformed odds and ends into a centerpiece. These salads might look odd to modern eyes, but back then, they were admired for their color, their structure, and their thrift. You could use lemon gelatin for vegetables or tomato aspic for savory meats. It stretched small portions and added elegance to a plate, especially for luncheons or church potlucks. Kids might poke at them, but guests often smiled and served themselves a slice. It was creative, yes, but more than that, it was economical. When refrigeration was unreliable and meat was expensive, gelatin preserved and presented all at once. Housewives made the most of what was left and made it look like something fresh. Today, it seems like a trend frozen in time. But at the time, it was just smart homemaking with a little showmanship on the side. Using dish towels to proof bread was a trick rooted in simplicity and trust. Before plastic wrap and modern proofing boxes, 1950s housewives would set their bread dough in a bowl, cover it with a clean kitchen towel, and find the warmest corner of the kitchen. The towel kept the dough safe from drafts, dust, and drying out. It also breathed, allowing the yeast to rise properly without trapping too much moisture. You could fold it gently over the bowl and check back an hour later to see the magic happen. Proofing bread was never about high-tech tools. It was about warmth, patience, and rhythm. The dish towel was part of that ritual. Every good baking day began with the smell of yeast and a soft cotton cloth ready to cover the future loaf. Housewives had a feel for timing that no machine could match. They watched dough rise like it was an old friend returning home. And the towel was more than fabric. It was a part of the process, passed down through habit and handed across generations. Boiling bones for soup broth was an act of transformation, taking scraps and turning them into something nourishing and deeply flavorful. A leftover chicken carcass, beef knuckles, pork ribs, nothing went to waste. Housewives would toss the bones into a pot with onion ends, carrot tops, and peppercorns, then let it simmer low and slow. Hours later, they had a rich stock ready to be the base for a dozen different meals. No cartons, no cubes, just the honest flavor of what was left behind. It made soups heartier, gravies deeper, and even plain rice a little more special. Bones were not trash. They were the beginning of something. Housewives understood that a good broth meant tomorrow's dinner was halfway done. This was not just thrift, it was skill. Broth making was a quiet background job in the rhythm of home life. You did it while the laundry dried or while you wiped the table. It filled the house with comfort before anyone took a bite. Canned fruit cocktail as a dessert base was the sweet secret at the end of many 1950s meals. With real fruit hard to keep fresh and budget stretched thin, those little syrupy cans were a godsend. Cherries, pears, peaches, grapes, all diced and ready to pour. Housewives would layer the fruit with whipped cream, gelatin, or cottage cheese to create something that looked fancy and felt indulgent. It was easy, fast, and colorful. Kids loved it, husbands asked for seconds, and guests never complained. These desserts came together with minimal effort but plenty of flair. You might call it ambrosia, fluff, or just fruit salad, but it was more than the sum of its parts. A few spoonfuls brought color to a beige dinner and comfort to tired families. These cans lined pantry shelves like promise in a tin. Whether topped with shredded coconut, marshmallows, or a dollop of cream, the cocktail did its job well. And it did so with the kind of quiet reliability that defined homemaking in the 1950s. Wrapping sandwiches in wax paper rolls was the go-to method for packing love into a lunch. Plastic bags were not always around, and foil was saved for the big stuff. So housewives would roll sandwiches tightly in wax paper, sometimes tying them off with twine or ribbon. It kept the bread fresh and the filling in place, and when unwrapped, the sandwich still looked crisp, not smushed. It was part presentation, part preservation. A school lunch wrapped this way looked neat and thoughtful. For working husbands and school children alike, it was a small sign that someone had taken time to make lunch right. Wax paper had a soft crackle that was almost comforting to unfold. It did not sweat, it did not stick, and it could be tucked right back into a lunch pail when done. In an age before single-use plastics ruled the kitchen, this was the gold standard. It was clean, smart, and just a little sentimental. Homemade cracker crumbs for coating meat were the breadcrumb before breadcrumbs. If a housewife ran out of store-bought crumbs or never bought them in the first place, she reached for a sleeve of saltines. Crushed finely with a rolling pin or the bottom of a glass, the crackers became a crispy coating for chicken cutlets, pork chops, or even fried tomatoes. They stuck well, browned beautifully, and brought a savory crunch to whatever hit the skillet. You could season the crumbs or leave them plain, depending on the dish. Saltines were cheap, shelf-stable, and always on hand, which made them perfect for coating duty. Housewives made it look easy, and it was. It also meant no waste, since stale crackers were even better for the job. These crumbs were humble, but they worked hard. And in a time where every part of the pantry had a purpose, they earned their place at the table. Using scissors to cut herbs and bacon was one of those simple tricks that just made sense. Before food processors and fancy slicers, housewives relied on kitchen shears for the small stuff. A quick snip of chives over a salad, a rough cut of parsley into a soup, or even slicing bacon into strips before it hit the pan, it was all faster with scissors. You did it right over the dish, with no cutting board to clean. Less mess, more control. It felt precise and easy, especially when time was tight. The same shears used to open packages or trim butcher paper were rinsed and put right to work. They were sturdy, reliable, and always within reach. This trick was not flashy, but it saved minutes when minutes mattered. Even kids could learn to use them safely under watchful eyes. And while modern kitchens come with gadgets for everything, sometimes all you need is a good pair of scissors and a steady hand. Double-duty broiler drawers were the toaster ovens of their time, except they came built right into the stove. Found just under the oven, the broiler drawer was where housewives melted cheese, crisped breadcrumbs, or gave sandwiches that perfect golden top. It heated fast and got hot, really hot. If you were careful, you could slide in a tray of garlic bread or a casserole and get a bubbly browned finish in minutes. It also doubled as a way to toast bread slices before toasters were standard in every home. This drawer saved time and effort. It was right there, part of the rhythm of cooking. You learned to use it without burning your fingers, and once you did, it became your best-kept secret. Housewives loved its versatility. It did not need extra space on the counter. It did its job well and quietly. These drawers were small, hot, and powerful, just like the women who used them. Dry mustard rubs were more than just a way to flavor meat. They were a quiet method of preservation long before refrigerators took over. A generous dusting of dry mustard, often mixed with salt, pepper, and a few pantry spices, was rubbed deep into cuts of pork, beef, or even game. The mix helped dry the surface, seal in juices, and gave the meat a subtle bite that came alive once cooked. These rubs worked especially well when meat had to be kept cool in a cellar or icebox and used over several days. For families who could not afford to let anything spoil, it was a little layer of safety and a whole lot of flavor. As the meat rested, the mustard acted like a protective barrier, especially in roasts or loins. When you finally cooked it, that seasoning had sunk in all the way through. Some even used mustard rubs before curing or smoking. These days, we rarely think about spices as preservers. We expect refrigeration to do the work. But back then, a tin of mustard powder was one of the most useful things in the pantry. Cabbage water broth might not sound like much, but in the 1930s it was enough to keep people going. Boiling cabbage was already a regular routine, but families quickly learned to never pour the water down the drain. That cloudy, sulfur-scented liquid held nutrients, starch, and just enough flavor to turn into a soup base. Some would throw in a diced potato, a handful of onion skins, or a bit of old bread to thicken it. Others might add salt, if they had any, and call it a night. There was a kind of pride in making something from what others saw as nothing. It might not have tasted like much, but it was hot, filling, and warm on cold days when spirits were thin. In some houses, that broth became the start of a stew that would stretch out over days. You reused everything back then, especially the things no one thought to save. Even the cabbage leaves, once cooked soft and pale, might be mashed and eaten with a splash of vinegar. But the broth was the heart of it. It told a story of making do with what you had, even if it was only boiled water and scraps. It was soup born of hardship and resilience. Another big thing that people would always do? Repurposing furniture. Seriously, there was nothing like that. You could give old furniture an entirely new vibe with just a bit of paint here and there, some polish, a good dusting, and some fabric. People during the Depression went into their creative hobbies as much as they could, like sewing, crocheting, woodwork, carpentry, and stuff like that. It meant that they learned their way around the rusty and dusty furniture that they were so used to seeing in their homes and knew how to put some life back into it. Instead of going to IKEA and wasting yet another quarter of your paycheck on goods you don't need, you could just do this. Boiled bread dumplings were a Depression lifesaver when meat was gone and vegetables were thin. Families took stale bread, ends or crusts, and soaked them in water or milk until soft. Then they added flour, maybe an egg, and salt or onion. This got rolled into dumplings and boiled until firm. They soaked up broth and stretched soups into meals that could feed 5 instead of 2. The texture was dense, like a sponge that clung to every drop of flavor. Sometimes they were served with just gravy or fat drippings. They were not pretty, but they filled you up and gave the illusion of plenty. And in a time when illusions were all you had, that meant something. Bread dumplings turned trash into dinner, and that was enough. Soda pop in cake batter sounds like a kid's prank, but for decades it was a real kitchen trick, and one that actually worked. When families were short on eggs, butter, or milk, they found that a can of cola or lemon lime soda added not just sweetness, but airiness to boxed cake mixes. The bubbles acted like a leavening agent, giving the batter a lift and a fluffiness that surprised even skeptical bakers. Lemon lime soda went into yellow cakes and cupcakes, while cola paired beautifully with chocolate. The result was a moist, tender crumb that needed no buttercream to be good. Sometimes people would even mix flavored gelatin powder into the batter to amp up the color and make it match the soda. Bright pink for strawberry soda, green for lime, orange for, well, orange. It was part dessert, part science experiment, and always a hit at potlucks and school parties. You would find versions of this in cookbooks with titles like Fun with Cake Mixes or Desserts for a Crowd. Even today, some bakers swear it is the fastest way to get a light, fluffy cake without worrying about what is in the fridge. And they are not wrong. Potato boil water for gravy base is one of those tricks that feels too simple to matter, until you taste it. When you boil potatoes, the water turns cloudy and thick with starch. Most people pour it down the drain, but the old cooks saved it. That cloudy water was liquid gold, perfect for thickening gravies, stews, or even making a quick roux without needing butter or flour. It added body and just a hint of potato flavor, which paired beautifully with meat scraps or leftover vegetables. It was warm, filling, and somehow made everything else taste richer. You could stir in pan drippings or a spoonful of mustard or vinegar, and have something that passed for a real sauce. Nothing fancy, but deeply satisfying. This trick barely shows up in cookbooks today, even though it worked better than some of the thickeners you find on store shelves. It was a quiet skill, one you learned by watching, not by reading. And once you knew it, you never threw out potato water again. Rendered bacon grease was one of those things every household in the 1930s held on to like it was gold. When you could not afford fresh butter or oil, the fat left over from breakfast bacon became your miracle ingredient. After the skillet cooled, people would scrape the drippings into jars and stash them away for everything: beans, biscuits, gravy, cornbread, even cooked vegetables. It was smoky, salty, and rich, and it turned even plain cabbage or boiled potatoes into something comforting. If you were lucky enough to have some cracklings left in the mix, all the better. Bacon itself was a luxury, but the grease stretched that flavor over a dozen meals. Nothing went to waste, not even the fat in the pan. Families would pass these jars down week to week like heirlooms, and it was not uncommon for a mother to teach her child exactly when the grease was good and when it had gone off. It kept things edible, and in a lot of homes, it kept the whole meal together. It is not just a trick. It was a survival tactic that added flavor when seasoning was a distant dream. A spoonful of bacon grease could mean the difference between bland and bearable. Another thing that people always did was prepare their own homemade snacks. People would make granola bars at home or bake their own little potato chips and corn chips, and it was actually such a nice thing to do because you wouldn't have to take out so much money for literally just 2 or 3 bites of a snack. Plus, these days, snacks cost as much as an outside meal from a restaurant does. It's actually a little insane, you know? Do you know what a jar of Nutella costs nowadays? Isn't it so much easier to just bake some cookies at home and call it a day? Celery and onion soup was bare bones, but it comforted. In homes where meat was missing and vegetables were gone by midweek, all you had were scraps. Celery tops, onion peels, maybe a clove of garlic. These simmered in water for hours, making broth that tasted better than expected. If you had grease or drippings, they went in. Bread crusts were added for body, and sometimes a bit of flour thickened it. The smell was half the meal, a warm scent that made you think something grand was cooking. But the truth was simpler. You were eating what others threw out. Still, in the 1930s, this was cooking smart. It gave warmth, flavor, and one more night of feeling okay. Peanut butter and meatloaf might sound like a dare, but in the mid-century kitchen, it was just another thrifty trick. Ground beef was expensive, especially when you were trying to feed more mouths than you had meat. So home cooks started mixing in all sorts of things to bulk it up: breadcrumbs, oats, mashed beans, and yes, peanut butter. A few spoonfuls of peanut butter made the mixture stickier and easier to mold, added a little fat for moisture, and brought a nutty depth that some people genuinely came to love. The flavor was subtle, not overpowering, and often paired with ketchup or tomato sauce on top to balance it out. You would find this idea popping up in wartime rationing cookbooks and community recipe swaps, usually in the margins with little notes like "kids did not notice" or "husband approved." It was especially popular in places where peanuts were cheap and beef was not. These meatloaves were humble, hearty, and surprisingly flavorful, and when baked right, they held together beautifully. The next time you are low on ingredients and high on curiosity, try it. You might understand why people kept doing it even after the war ended. Pan toasting stale bread for crumb coating was not just clever, it was essential. You did not throw out old bread. You let it dry, you crumbled it with your fingers, and you tossed it into a hot skillet to toast. No oil, no butter, just dry heat. The smell alone was comforting, warm, nutty, toasty in a way that made you feel like something good was coming. Once browned, you could crush it finer and use it to coat fish, chicken, or vegetables before frying, or sprinkle it on casseroles to give them a crisp top layer. It gave texture and taste to anything soft or soggy. Kids who grew up on this trick remember the sound of that skillet scraping across the stovetop more than they remember store-bought breadcrumbs. Today, most people buy theirs in boxes, but those never taste quite the same. Pan-toasted crumbs were a small act of resourcefulness, born from the kind of hunger that made you see potential in every stale slice. Celery and onion soup was bare bones, but it comforted. In homes where meat was missing and vegetables were gone by midweek, all you had were scraps. Celery tops, onion peels, maybe a clove of garlic. These simmered in water for hours, making broth that tasted better than expected. If you had grease or drippings, they went in. Bread crusts were added for body, and sometimes a bit of flour thickened it. The smell was half the meal, a warm scent that made you think something grand was cooking. But the truth was simpler. You were eating what others threw out. Still, in the 1930s, this was cooking smart. It gave warmth, flavor, and one more night of feeling okay. Bacon grease as a biscuit fat substitute was not just clever, it was common sense. When butter was too pricey or scarce and shortening was rationed, folks used what was already in the pan. Bacon grease, saved in a can or jar near the stove, became the go-to for biscuits, cornbread, and frying. It added depth, richness, and just a hint of smoke. Strained to remove bits, chilled until firm, it worked like lard and made everything taste better. You saw it in Southern cookbooks, recipe cards, and wartime pamphlets. For many, it was just the way things were done, and if someone threw it out, they probably did not grow up cooking. It was humble, it was honest, and it made unforgettable biscuits. Also, buying things in bulk is always very much a good idea. Back then, they would buy lots of things in bulk because they didn't know if it was going to be in stock later. You remember the pandemic, right? People were doing pretty much the exact same thing, but this time, instead of canning offal and meats, we had people scalping toilet paper and hoarding sanitizers. If you took a little bit of that logic and applied it, though, it's actually really helpful. Buying in bulk leaves you prepared, and you'll probably get a discount if you're buying right from a wholesaler. Gravy powder from pan scrapings was the kind of invention that came from hunger and a good sense of timing. After roasting or frying, the browned bits at the bottom of the pan were never wasted. They were scraped, dried slowly in the oven or near the stove, and then ground into a coarse powder that could last for weeks. A spoonful stirred into hot water gave you instant gravy, no bouillon cubes, no jars, no packets. It tasted real because it was. That powder held the memory of every meal it came from: roast chicken, seared chops, bacon ends. Some cooks even mixed it with flour and lard to make little gravy starter balls, ready to go at a moment's notice. The flavor was deep, smoky, and hard to pin down because it came from life, not a label. Today, we throw those scrapings away. We clean pans too quickly. But back then, this was the best part. It turned yesterday's effort into tomorrow's comfort. Rice-stuffed baked apples were one of those meals that towed the line between dinner and dessert. Apples stored well through winter, and rice was cheap, filling, and easy to cook. Together, they made something practical and gently sweet. You hollowed an apple, stuffed it with cooked rice, and baked it until it softened and started to collapse. If you had cinnamon or brown sugar, great. If not, a pat of lard did the trick. Some added milk to make it creamier. It was not fancy or meant to impress, but it filled stomachs and made children smile. In a time where smiles were hard to come by, that counted. These apples were often served after a bowl of soup or beans as a way to end on something soft. They warmed the kitchen and reminded folks that even hard times had gentle endings. Hot dog octopus garnish is what happens when creativity meets childhood joy. Mid-century party cookbooks, especially the ones aimed at birthday parties or school lunches, loved a good gimmick. And turning an ordinary hot dog into a smiling octopus? That was peak culinary fun for kids. The trick was simple. Slice one end of a hot dog into strips, boil it for a minute or two, and watch the legs curl outward like tentacles. The result was a goofy, wiggly hot dog that looked like it belonged in a cartoon and tasted like backyard summer. Parents would set them on top of mac and cheese, mashed potatoes, or even tuck them into lunchboxes with a smiley face drawn in mustard. It cost next to nothing but made kids feel like they were eating something special. These octopus dogs became so popular that some cookbooks devoted whole sections to fun food just like it. It was a different kind of food styling, one that made meals exciting without any fuss or frosting. And really, When you are 5 years old, who would not love a sea creature made of meat? Have you ever heard of using cloth napkins and towels? They might not feel as good as the paper products we're used to and have been familiar with since the, start of our lives, but they do save a pretty penny. The thing is, all of this is a lifestyle choice. These little tips and tricks on their own might not add too much, but you buy the cloth napkin, you make the snack at home, you make a DIY detergent, and you start to see enough money bubbling up in your account at month's end. Eventually. Corncob broth for soups was one of those recipes that showed how deep American resourcefulness really went. After eating fresh corn, you did not toss the cobs. You simmered them. A big pot of water, a few bare cobs, maybe some onion or pepper if you had it. The cobs still held sweetness and starch, which thickened the broth and gave it a soft, buttery flavor. It became the perfect base for chowders, bean stews, or simple vegetable soups. Some people even froze the used cobs for winter cooking. Nothing was wasted. This trick worked especially well in the South and Midwest, where corn was king. It made your kitchen smell like summer, even in January. These days, most people would never think to keep a cob after the kernels are gone. But for those who remember, it was like getting a second meal for free. Cabbage leaf meat preservers were the poor man's parchment paper. When you had a small cut of meat and needed it to stay moist, you wrapped it in cabbage leaves. The leaves kept the juices in, added a faint sweetness, and softened up into something you could eat alongside the roast. You could bake it, steam it, or even tuck it into a skillet with a lid. The trick worked with ground meat, too. Stuffed cabbage rolls were just a natural evolution. It was popular among Eastern European immigrants, but caught on fast across rural America. The cabbage acted like a seal, but it was edible, cheap, and always around. People grew cabbage in their gardens and used every bit of it. Today, we use foil or fancy bags to lock in moisture, but back then, a cabbage leaf did the job just fine. One of the easiest things to do during the Depression to just save a bit more extra cash was planning your meals ahead. If you knew the kind of schedule you were following and what you were working with, then you wouldn't need to be worrying about what to eat, when to eat, and how much to eat. You might be thinking this is a little overboard to start with, but during the Depression, it really was that deep. Luckily, we don't need to carry that same meticulous style of planning and intensity with how things are today. While they're still pretty bad, at least we aren't talking 1930s bad. Scrap-fried hash was the kind of meal that told you exactly how your week had gone, by what ended up in the pan. Families would take the odds and ends from dinner all week long, bits of meat, soft vegetables, maybe a few spoonfuls of rice or beans, and toss them into a skillet with grease and onion. Fried together, pressed down, and turned crisp, it became something new. Not quite a stew, not quite a cake, just a hash. You never made it the same way twice, but somehow it always came out tasting like something more than the sum of its parts. Some households planned for it, saving their scraps carefully in a tin. Others pulled it together on nights when there was not enough of any one thing. It was salty, savory, and always hot. You could stretch it with potatoes, bulk it out with gravy, or stuff it in bread and call it a sandwich. What mattered was that it filled plates and kept everyone quiet for a while. Scrap-fried hash was not just thrifty, it was practical hope on a plate. Whipped evaporated milk for desserts was the poor man's whipped cream, and for some it tasted even better. It came in a can, sat on the shelf for months, and was far cheaper than real cream. To make it work, you chilled the can, poured the thick milk into a bowl, and whipped it hard. Some added sugar or vanilla, but it held its shape without much help. It was not as rich as real cream, but it held firm and had a clean, milky flavor. People used it in mousses, icebox cakes, and pies that needed lift without weight. It popped up in retro cookbooks as a budget topping or emergency fix. During rationing or tight weeks, it was a go-to solution. And for families who grew up with it, the taste still brings back birthdays, bake sales, and simple Sunday treats. Bacon grease jar cooking was not just a habit, it was a household rule. You never threw out bacon fat, not once. It was poured hot into a tin can or a glass jar, usually kept by the stove, and reused for just about everything. Fried potatoes, sautéed greens, biscuits brushed on top for that golden shine. Some families even swore by it for making popcorn. It added flavor where there was none and stretched what little fat you had across the whole week. Bacon grease turned bland cabbage into something rich and smoky. It revived day-old cornbread and crisped up onions like nothing else. The jar was never labeled, and no one needed it to be. You just knew what it was by the smell. Today, we are told to throw away fat and use olive oil instead. But back then, this was gold. It was seasoning, substance, and thrift all in one. And even though it is missing from most cookbooks now, that old bacon jar still lives on in a few quiet kitchens that remember its worth. Tomato aspic salad was a Depression-era invention that tried its best to look fancy when there was nothing in the pantry but pantry itself. It was made by dissolving gelatin in hot tomato juice, then mixing in chopped onions, celery, vinegar, and sometimes even shredded carrots if you had them. Once it was poured into a mold or a shallow dish and chilled, it firmed up into something like a savory jelly. It sounds odd to us now, but back in the 1930s, it was considered a creative way to stretch tomatoes and vegetables into a salad-like side dish. It was cold, tangy, and often served at community meals or church suppers when no one could afford fresh produce. Housewives took pride in slicing it clean and presenting it on a bed of wilted lettuce or cabbage leaves. It looked elegant in its strange little way, like a meal trying to be better than it was. Some topped it with a spoonful of mayonnaise or cottage cheese to add richness, though most just served it plain. Tomato aspic may not have been anyone's favorite dish, but it was admired for how little it took to make something that felt proper. Potato chip casserole topping was one of those strange little tricks that somehow made dinner feel like a treat. Back in the day, people did not have access to fancy breadcrumbs or crunchy imported cheeses, and boxed mixes were still a novelty. But they almost always had a bag of plain potato chips sitting around, maybe a little stale, maybe half-eaten, maybe on sale. So when it came time to top a casserole, instead of breadcrumbs or fried onions, cooks reached for that crinkled bag, crushed it up in their hands, and sprinkled the pieces across the top. Into the oven it went, and out came something golden, salty, and unexpectedly satisfying. That simple potato chip crust made otherwise bland casseroles feel indulgent, and the trick was proudly passed down in community cookbooks, church bulletins, and lunchroom chatter. It was cheap, it was crunchy, and best of all, it used something people already had. There were even recipes that told you to mix the crushed chips with melted margarine or powdered cheese before baking, because if you were going to commit to a topping, you might as well go all in. There is just something so right about a casserole with a potato chip crown. Old coffee reboil with eggshells was a second chance in a cup. When fresh coffee grounds were scarce or when no one could afford to waste them, you would reuse the old grounds with a little twist. You cracked an eggshell into the pot before boiling. The shell helped settle the grit and bitterness, giving the brew a smoother, clearer taste. Sometimes you added a splash of cold water at the end to help the grounds sink even further. The result was not gourmet, but it was strong, hot, and clean. It got you through another morning. People called it cowboy coffee or camp coffee, but it was just what folks did when the tin of beans was running low. It taught you how to make something better with what little you had left. You will not find this on a fancy cafe menu. But for a long time, it was how real people started their day. Cabbage water broth might not sound like much, but in the 1930s, it was enough to keep people going. Boiling cabbage was already a regular routine, but families quickly learned to never pour the water down the drain. That cloudy, sulfur-scented liquid held nutrients, starch, and just enough flavor to turn into a soup base. Some would throw in a diced potato, a handful of onion skins, or a bit of old bread to thicken it. Others might add salt, if they had any, and call it a night. There was a kind of pride in making something from what others saw as nothing. It might not have tasted like much, but it was hot, filling, and warm on cold days when spirits were thin. In some houses, that broth became the start of a stew that would stretch out over days. You reused everything back then, especially the things no one thought to save. Even the cabbage leaves, once cooked soft and pale, might be mashed and eaten with a splash of vinegar. But the broth was the heart of it. It told a story of making do with what you had, even if it was only boiled water and scraps. It was soup born of hardship and resilience. Cold water shrinking for pie shells is one of those clever tricks almost lost to time. When you blind bake a pie crust, baking it without filling, it tends to puff or slump. Today, people use weights or beans to hold it in place. But back then, you would drop the shell briefly into a bowl of cold water just before baking. The sudden chill made the dough contract, hugging the pan tighter and holding its shape. It was a small act with a big result. No gadgets, no guesswork, just a bowl of cold water, a steady hand, and a bit of faith. This method worked especially well for custard pies or fruit pies that needed a crisp bottom. It also prevented bubbling and cracking, something even experienced bakers still fight with. You would not find this tip in many modern cookbooks. It was more likely to be passed from grandmother to granddaughter with a wink. Sometimes the simplest answers are the ones we forget first. If these clever tricks stirred up a memory, share your favorite below, tap like and subscribe to keep the wisdom of 50s kitchens alive.